All right, I want to talk to you about inflation, but I'm going to try to break this down into everyman terms, and it's difficult, but when you understand it, it's not difficult at all, and the answers become very, very obvious on what we are to do. Inflation is heating up all across the economy. Mathematically, that is guaranteed to do that. That is going to happen if you start printing money and pumping cash into the system. Increases in the money flow always result in corresponding increase in prices. Why? Because there are more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. And inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. That's what makes the price go up. Inflation. Your average high school economics student can do this math, but somehow the PhDs at the Fed can't. The official inflation number now, as of yesterday, was 4.2%. That was a lot more than the Fed was expecting or anybody was expecting, less than what I was expecting. If you look at the old, we did this yesterday, if you look at the old index, if you look at the way we used to model it, it's between 11 and 13%. If you look, or 8 and 13%, actually, if you look at the number from the 90s. But if you look at consumer inflation with more modernized index that measure real-world 2021 cost of living, they are showing inflation sitting at closer to 12% for the month. But these numbers mean nothing. They only mean something to you when you go to the grocery store or you try to buy something. Are you paying more or are you paying less? Are we going in the right direction or the wrong direction? The disturbing news here is if you look at the producer price index, this is the index that predicts future consumer prices because the products to make products, you know what I mean? The steel to make the cars or the widgets or the fertilizer or the alfalfa to feed the cattle, you look at those things and say it's going to cost these people more, so they're going to have to charge more at the end. The producer price index shows the prices passed on to consumers in various ways is sitting at 22%. That's the inflation that is still yet to come. The PPI measures commodities that companies have to pay to build and make stuff. The commodities are not part of the consumer price index. Copper, steel, aluminum, lumber, corn, cobalt, rubber, all of this stuff. We know lumber is up nearly 400% in the last 12 months. Copper is up 100%. Well, that's going to get much, much worse if we actually do fix infrastructure and our electrical grids and everything else, because that's all copper. When the United States government is going to buy billions and billions and billions of copper, how do you think you're going to get the copper for your house? Is it going to be up or down in price? Corn is up over 100%, including 50% in just the last 2 months. So if producer prices predict future consumer prices, the rapid inflation we're seeing in consumer prices isn't just transitory, as the Bank of America called it. And they're not saying it's transitory inflation. They're saying it's transitory hyperinflation. What's coming our way will be with us, maybe if we're lucky, for months. It could be years. And I'll explain why. The Fed says it will be temporary and it's going away, but given the trillions of dollars they flooded into the economy, it would be some time before all that currency sloshing around can be sucked up. So how do you fix inflation? Why? This was the charter of the Fed, to ensure the money supply, the full faith and credit, and to keep inflation under control, right? Okay, so they have two weapons you can fight inflation with. The first, it's a wad the Fed has already shot. It can restrict the currency supply. The classic definition of inflation is the increase in the currency supply that drives an increase in the prices of goods and services because people now have money, they go out and buy things. So in reverse, A decrease in the currency supply must inherently cause a decrease in the price of goods and services. That only makes sense. That's the way it's done. There are two ways. Okay. In this case, between Uncle Sam and Uncle Fed, $12 trillion in COVID stimulus funds have already been released into the economy. The currency is already out there. So you can't restrict the currency because it's already out the door, gang. Already driving up prices, already burning holes in the pockets of banks and mega corporations that are busy buying back their stock and paying bonuses to brokers. Now, the other major policy tool the Fed has to fight inflation is interest rates. This one gets really interesting fast. How do you suck all of that money back in? The Fed loans banks money, and they say it's 5% interest. So the bank has to pay the Fed 5% interest. What the Fed does with that 5%, they don't treat it as a profit, they burn it. Okay? That's what brings the money supply down. Imagine how much burning would have to go on for this. In the 1970s, Paul Volcker, who was not a popular guy at the time with some, he staved off inflation rates of 14% a month by raising the federal funds borrowing rate to 17%. So the Fed said to the banks, you want to borrow money? It's 17%. Then banks would add another 3% of profit on top of that. So you're looking at almost a mob loan. And it almost stopped the heart of the economy, but it pulled all that cash back. Okay. By the time Reagan won the election in 1980, inflation had dropped from 14% to 4.3%. All you have to do is raise the interest rates. Okay. Here's why the Fed can't do that. They're saying, we're not going to do this for probably a couple of years because we got to see that. No, they're never going to do it. They're never going to do it. Here's why. Rock, meet hard place. When Volcker raised the interest rates to 17%, making it really expensive for anybody to borrow money, the U.S. federal debt was just below $700 billion. We owed less than $1 trillion. GDP ratio, 33%. Today, our U.S. federal debt is $28.4 trillion. That's today. That's not including all of the stimulus and everything else that the Fed has done. $28.4 trillion. Our debt to GDP ratio sits at 130%. Oh, by the way, that debt and debt to GDP, both all-time highs. And they're both all-time highs before the Biden-Harris COVID bailouts and Green New Infrastructure Part 1, Part 2. By year's end, estimates point to around $31 trillion in debt and 135% debt to GDP. So why am I talking about any of this? Let me go back to Volcker in the 1980s when he raised interest rates to 17%. It would be the death knell of the United States of America. Today we have over $28 trillion in debt. That debt is made up of various types of interest-bearing bonds. They're short-term bonds. When people buy them, you get an interest rate. We're borrowing money from people, and it's like we have an adjustable rate. That's what you have to understand. When interest rates go up, you don't want an adjustable rate. You want to lock your mortgage into that low rate, right? Our loans aren't locked in. They're adjustable, kind of, because we are constantly borrowing to keep that going. So when they raise interest rates, you get into something called the cost of servicing the debt. I love that. The cost of servicing the debt is going to go up. What does that mean? That means run like you're running from the gates of hell now. The interest paid out to the bondholders is based on the federal fund's borrowing rate. So if the Fed increases the cost of borrowing, the cost goes up for Uncle Sam as well. So the interest the government has to pay out against all of this debt increases every time the Fed raises the interest rates. When U.S. debt was low, higher interest rates were painful but not deadly. But when we're closing in on $30 trillion and deficits projected in the $2 to $3 trillion a year for the next 5 years, the cost of servicing that is going to outpace our ability to pay for it. Current debt, $28 trillion, round numbers. Currently, the Federal Reserve funds rate is 1%. And on average, U.S. bonds across all types pay an average of just under 2% in profit to anybody who we borrowed that money from. So you get 1.8%. So the current cost of servicing $28 trillion in debt at 1.8% is $504 billion every year in interest. $504 billion. So out of the total U.S. budget every year, this year, $3.2 trillion, $504 billion of that is just to pay interest.
Already insanely high.
Insane, and that's 1.8. You want to guess what U.S. bonds paid out in 1977 when Volcker spiked the Fed fund rate to 17%? You want to guess what that is? U.S. bonds paid an average of 7.99%. That is 444% higher than it is today. So let's do the math. If the cost of the government to pay interest on the debt was 7.99% against a debt of today, $28 trillion, the annual debt servicing cost, just the interest, $2.2 trillion. Our entire budget is $3.2 trillion now, and they say there's no cookies in the counter that we can get rid of. There's nothing to it's all bare. Just the interest is $2.2 trillion. That means 3.2 that is supposed to cover everything: roads, bridges, military, courts, national parks, Social Security, Medicare, Obamacare. The interest due on the debt matched in 1977, nearly 70% of every dollar the government takes in would be going to pay interest. That's why they're never going to raise the rates, because they can't raise the rates. The only weapon left to fight inflation is to raise interest rates, but raising interest rates would put the government into a death spiral. Deficits don't matter. We've heard it from the right and the left. Yes, they do. Especially when you look at the interest that you have to pay. I know there are people that have adjustable mortgages. You got to get out of the adjustable mortgage. If you have an adjustable mortgage, you're screwed if they would ever raise the rates. You could lose your house because all of a sudden your payment goes from $500 to $800 a month because you're paying more interest. We're about to lose the house, gang. That's why all of this is happening now. They're spending like there's no tomorrow because there is no tomorrow for the dollar. Keep your powder dry. They say the government's never defaulted on debts. I think after last year and just the beginning of this year, I would swear off the word never.